Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Sally Nuamah. Dr. Nuamah is an associate professor of urban politics and human development at Northwestern University. Her research intersects with race, gender, education, and political behavior. Today we're going to discuss her latest book, Closed for Democracy: How Mass School Closure Undermines Citizenship of Black Americans. So I guess the first question is, why research and write this book?
Well, first, thanks so much, Dr. Art, for having me. This work is especially important at this case in the federal level, but also more locally here or around Chicago, where Chicago made history when it closed the most schools in a single year of any school district, 49 schools, up to 54 depending on who's counting. And a majority of those school closings happened in majority Black neighborhoods that were also low income. In fact, 90% of them occurred in those areas. Yeah. And when you think about schools being these critical mechanisms for social mobility, for getting access to democratic citizenship, we should expect that the mass closings of schools could actually have deep consequences for democracy and for our society at large.
And one of the things that you note in the book is that there's been a limited investigation or reporting on school closures and how it affects political behavior and how it affects the Black community in particular. One of the things that you noted is that over 1,000 schools are closed every year across the U.S., which affects about 200,000 students. But as you said, there's been minimal research. I guess the question is, and as you said, it affects largely the Black community, but so why is there such a disparity? School closings, I know they bring lower test scores, they bring poor attendance, they tend to create behavior problems if somebody has to transfer to a different school. So what are the larger consequences for Black students and for their families?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love that you already raised the potential sort of consequences socio-emotionally as well as physically and academically of school closings. And I think it's important to note that part of what we forget is that schools have been closing for decades, but where they close, right, has been pretty targeted, and that's why we're talking about the disproportionate impacts of them occurring in these Black and brown neighborhoods that are also low income. And so when a school closes, I just want to make it human for people. So you have the school in your neighborhood that you went to, maybe your family member went to as well, maybe your parents went to that school, and then one day you hear in the news that your school is on a list to be closed because it's a poor performing or the enrollment has declined. And a lot of this is happening to elementary school students. And so now on a Monday night when other kids are having dinner or playing soccer or doing an after school activity, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds are going to community meetings trying to explain to the district why their school shouldn't be closed. Yeah. This happens over the course of several months. So that's already, before the school decision is even made, you're already having an experience of being told that your school's a bad school and you're 8 years old and you're trying to defend your school against the district.
And you didn't have enough test scores to legitimately stay open because you're a failure of a school.
Exactly. So you're already told this before you even had a chance to sort of speak, and you're 8 years old and it's a Monday night and you have to go to defend your school. Then you go through this multiple kind of series process. Maybe your school is saved, but now you have the trauma of having endured this experience and the fear that this could happen again. Or your school's closed and now you have to integrate into another community. In either case, the kind of experience of having your school closed, which for many people is the first institutions in which they learn about government, in which they learn about their value relative to other people, it's a place that you feel safe. And now you're being told that like this public good is being taken away from you, right? And so what are the long-term consequences for your belief in government, for your desire to participate in democracy, for how you think you're valued as a citizen relative to others? Those are kind of broader consequences. Yes, there's also academic impacts because you're now having to integrate into a new place, but there's also the concern around the trauma of enduring that experience, your belief in, again, how you're valued compared to others. So there's several things that go beyond just the academic experience, but that are involved in just the process of engaging in a closure.
I lived in New Buffalo, and we had a a very large population that had free and reduced lunch. And so one of the things that happens with school closings, it would seem like that's going to affect the nutrition of all the students that used to be at that school. It's going to affect vaccinations, because often the vaccinations are conducted in schools. And then they don't learn about civic education, because even though where you may learn is if you're 6 or 7 years old and you go to this meeting to try to save the school, but you're missing out on whatever education you may have about how democracy is supposed to work.
And one of the major things that people who oppose school closings talk about is that our schools aren't just academic institutions. They're not just places to learn. Many people get their flu shots from schools, their main meals, unhoused children get their child care at schools. And so they say the schools often close because they think they're underutilized, and they're saying that you actually aren't accounting for the fact that schools are doing these other options and they're providing these other services. And so you're really raising a really important point about what people lose beyond the learning aspect when this public institution is closed. And this has followed the closing of libraries, the closing of hospitals, the closing of affordable housing. So the public school is sort of the last nail in the coffin.
Yeah. One of the things you quote, and I had it in a later question, was you give a quote from a parent who says the schools are the last remaining public institution.
Yes.
It's kind of been, as you say, libraries, healthcare, these things keep getting restricted and being pulled away. What are the impacts on people's understanding of American democracy? Because that's kind of a thread that goes along with the school closures, is how does this affect, in particular, the Black community's understanding of how democracy works, or how at least it's supposed to work?
Yeah, part of what I care about as a political scientist who studies schools and education is that larger question of how this impacts democracy. So my sense is that people learn about government and democracy through the institutions they interact with the most. And that for most Americans, that is schools.
Schools, yeah.
And
so
so
maybe the school board elections, or maybe, I mean, some places you don't even have the elections, they're getting appointed. But
I'm actually glad you raised that. We could talk about that piece too, how that's changing, right? And so whether it's a school board election or it's trying to defend against the closure, you're learning you're getting these really important experiences with democracy on the ground, and some of your earlier, most formative experiences with democracy. And so in places like Chicago or Philadelphia, where schools have closed en masse, these Black and brown communities that are already underprivileged become model citizens to save their schools. So what do I mean by that? They attend the community meetings, they go to protests, they push for an elected school board, they vote against the mayor that appointed the school board. They do everything that American democracy says one should do.
And they probably use a presentation style, a language that they develop so they can be more persuasive, and they have to speak the proper English, and I mean the list goes on
and on. They learn how to use quantitative data to demonstrate that they're actually supposed to stay open and how their school is going to be utilized. They develop all these civic skills that they're told that if they engage in, they'll be able to make their voice heard so that they could be responded to democratically. What they learn is that they do everything democracy asks of them, but their school is still closed. And they learn that it's not just a closure of their school, that the democratic system itself is closed to them for people like them. They could do everything that democracy claims one should do.
But it doesn't result in sometimes it results in saving the school, but other times they get steamrolled over by the mayor or the school board.
Most of the time. And even if their school is saved, unfortunately, in so many instances I recorded in the book, people end up finding that their school is saved, but the lease on their building wasn't renewed. Or their school is saved, but all the principal and 80% of the staff is fired. The school is the people, right? The school is the building. And so that becomes, so they have these sort of anticlimactic, or what I call Pyrrhic victories. Even when it feels like they win, they pretty much lose.
One of the things you highlight is Paul Vallis, who was he promoted neoliberal policies in the Chicago schools, emphasizing individual solutions, competition, what I would say is questionable standardized testing, high stakes testing, competition, promoting charter schools even. And then it's closely followed by punishment for those schools that don't seem to measure up to the tests or to the enrollment. But I just wonder if focusing on low enrollment and individualized solutions it may ignore the larger structural racist conditions that are systemic, that go way beyond Paul Vallis or Arnie Duncan or any other school supervisors, because it doesn't seem to be isolated to Philadelphia or Chicago or Newark, New Jersey or St. Paul, but it's one of the things you've done here. I mean, you've done an exceptional job of pulling on quantitative data and doing the ethnography and the interviews with people, which is, to me, it was very impressive picture of the map that you show in the book that shows where the schools have been closed the most. And they tend to be like, I saw Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, Newark, Miami, Houston, places that are, and as you have already said, the schools that were closed were largely black enrollment. So, but the question remains, is it more than the individual school supervisor, whether it's Arnie Duncan or Paul Vallis, or I don't remember the names of Philadelphia.
Without a doubt, right? So the reason why you're seeing such similarities across these various contexts in terms of who's targeted is because there's similar policies that preceded that really shaped the conditions for these closings to be possible. So as I mentioned before, many of these communities already lost public housing. These affordable housing communities were largely occupied, in part by people of color. And because of these neoliberal kinds of policies that are specifically like anti-black and anti-poor, it creates a situation where they make it unaffordable to live in the city, right? And so people are pushed out, and displaced is really the right word, to other contexts. And so the school enrollment declines. And then people say, well, it's school enrollment, that's the issue. But the reason why the school enrollment is declined is because public housing was closed because of like racist sort of policies, and then people were displaced. And so that becomes directly the, not addressing this housing issues was creating a issue around schooling.
And I would also take issue with the fact that enrollment declines, and that's the reason you have to close the school. It seems to me that if you have education with fewer students and smaller classes, you're going to have improved teaching across the board, all of which should lower costs, which has never happened when they've closed schools. As you say in the book, closing schools has never ended up reducing costs for the school system.
And that's what the community says. They're like, isn't there a lot of research that says smaller class sizes are actually better for us? So this is an opportunity to actually improve the quality of our education.
And you're going to lower the costs because presumably you would need fewer classrooms. You would have fewer, presumably, I don't want to have teachers being laid off, but you have fewer teachers, fewer need for a big administration because you have the fewer students and more success in your teaching and learning.
And the schools that these communities have to compare themselves to, like in the context of Chicago, to schools sort of on the north side, have those kinds of class sizes and resources available to them. And people are saying, well, that is why you see the outcomes that you see in those spaces. So give us an opportunity to be able to do the same. I just want to reemphasize what you said, which is like, and the hard part about it is communities kind of feel gaslit because they say it's to save money. Or to improve the academic outcomes, and both of those do not happen.
Charters, as you point out in your early on in the book, actually, you'd point out that charter schools haven't been the solution that they've been presented as. So you refer several times to civic engagement and participation by parents, teachers, even students, but you express concern about what you call collective participatory debt, which you describe as mobilization fatigue. I thought maybe you could explain a little bit more about what this concept, because it's almost like an invented concept, but I understand. Collective participatory debt, what does that mean?
Yes, so this is a term that I developed to explain when people are engaged repeatedly in a process for which they do not receive democratic responsiveness, and that the democratic responsiveness is not adequate to what they would expect given their participation. And part of what that came out of was observing these communities who were going to great lengths to try to defend against their closure. Again, attending PTA meetings, doing protests, going to community meetings, going to public hearings, trying to get a school board elected by going to ward, going to vote against the mayor at the time, which was Rahm Emanuel, and then still not receiving the kind of responsiveness that one would expect given their participation. And people would describe themselves as essentially completely disillusioned with the democratic process following that. And I mentioned this term before about a Pyrrhic victory, where even when they won, they felt it was at an unsustainable cost. And that essentially their efforts don't mean anything in the context of a democracy.
Even, the interesting thing to me was you even suggested that this distrust in the government arises even if school closures are prevented by community actions. So we won, but the process may have convinced people that the government is not responsive to us, even though you've won by having protests and actions and demonstrations, but you don't feel like you got to make you were able to make the actual decision. It wasn't put to a vote of all the parents here that would like to, you don't have democracy in action. It's only the semblance of democracy.
That's exactly it. And in political science, we call it kind of window dressing participation, right? So you go to this event or you go to this community meeting that the district supposedly called. There's people sitting at the front. None of them are decision makers. Or they are decision makers, but they say absolutely nothing after people voice their opinion, right? They get 2 minutes to speak, which is not enough time to defend your school against anything. Imagine having an argument with your significant other. Like 2 minutes is not enough, right? Oh. And so they kind of don't know what to make of these outcomes, right, when they do occur. And then when they do occur, as I mentioned before, because they're often followed by these other kinds of systemic sort of dismantling.
Well, you have Paul Vallis, but then he's replaced by Arne Duncan, and then he goes off to become the Obama person for Department of Education, and he's going to influence things nationwide.
And he does.
With promoting charter schools, the high stakes testing, all of the things which. Generally, teachers don't like those things because it interferes with them teaching, because now they're teaching to the test to make sure that their students in their class get high scores on the tests, so then they will show that they've been competitive. But the teachers in general don't, at least the teachers I was on the school board in New Buffalo for about 12 years.
Okay,
and
so
many of the teachers would just outright, they would have to do it because it was a requirement, but they didn't ever like it. And they tried to put in things around it which would allow them to actually teach to the level that the students were at that particular moment.
And it undermines the broader civic function of schools, right? You're teaching to the test, but they're not learning about these questions around citizenship, and how
you're not even learning about history. Now it's like with the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it becomes more difficult even to teach not just black history, but women's history, the history of the Vietnam War, the history of slavery. All of these things are now presumably off the books, starting in Florida, maybe coming to Indiana, but it's a nationwide effort to crush the history that presumably everybody needs to know. Because if you don't know where you came from, you really can't know where you're going.
Without a doubt. And the thing about DEI, and that's why I care so much about looking at these sort of micro examples, because people think they're not microcosms for this broader political moment that we're in, and it is. This thing that happened in Chicago or Philadelphia or Newark, 10 years ago or 5 years ago is really just indicative of what we're seeing now. At the national level, you see a federal school closure. The defunding of the Department of Education, the dismantling of federal funding to public schools is a closure.
Yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah, because if you can't pay the salaries for the teachers, or if you can't pay for the maintenance of the buildings, and if that money's cut federally, there's less money available. I mean, I think you mentioned in the case of Philadelphia, the governor even cut the budget, the state budget for schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
and then federal funding had declined also over that same period, in part because these efforts were focused on this portfolio model where, whether it's race to the top or even the ESEA, where they say one of the actions that can happen if you don't meet this criteria is your school could convert it to a charter or it can be closed.
yeah.
And so
Close it, then it'll convert to a charter.
Right. And funding becomes associated with that.
Yes.
So then school districts lose these resources. And at the federal level, the defunding of the Department of Education is going to be followed by the creation of similar kinds of alternatives that you already see at the local level.
One of the things that you stress in the book is that you're not looking at social movements, protest, or resistance. However, it seems to me that the actions that were taken by the Chicago Teachers Union and citizens that got organized in sustained actions that were actually helped prevent closures have been effective in protecting local schools. So it seems, on the other hand, it seems like reliance on getting a black elected official hasn't brought much joy. Right? I mean, we may have 60 or 70 black elected officials in Congress, but they haven't acted collectively to prevent school closures.
So I'm glad you're raising this. So what I was trying to say is not that I'm not focused or on social movements per se, but more so that this isn't just about organized groups engaging in bringing in everyday people into their efforts. This is everyday people in communities and parents and families deciding
that actually form a social, that actually
come together to protect their
Yeah.
communities. And your part about what we call descriptive representation, that's this idea that because a person looks like you in office, that's going to enable policy change for your community.
Presumably.
Right, presumably. And we don't always see that, right?
Yeah.
And what we really want is substantive representation. That's maybe the person looks like you, but they also enact policies that help people who look like you. And in Chicago, in Detroit, and Philadelphia, we don't always see that. And in Chicago, in Philadelphia, because they have experiences with that, they're looking for people who are actually going to engage in the actions that's going to help protect their communities so they can save these last public institutions.
Staying on this topic for a second, because you wrote about agency of marginalized communities. And when I saw that, I thought of the SCLC, the Panthers, even W.E.B. Du Bois, and the early NAACP. So what I'm suggesting here is I hope to see another book that talks about organized, sustained resistance by labor and the social movements that are successful and can be successful.
Yeah. So. Can I just say a quick thing on that? One reason why the CPD, or collective participatory debt, concept was so important to me is I wanted to recognize this question of whose responsibility is it to ensure that people who are marginalized have improved material conditions, right? And I think, sure, these groups who are already under-resourced can labor, but it's also really, really important that democracy responds to them and sort of does what they
I
say
would
they
push
will
that
do.
a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think that democracy has to be extended to the people that can actually make the decisions, because if you're relying upon some elected official, whether it's a mayor or a school board that is either elected or appointed, or black elected officials.
And that it's really paternalistic to say that people shouldn't be able to make decisions about their own lives.
Yes. You wrote that the effects of school closures on political behavior remain unclear, but I think your entire book reveals very clear effects. So maybe you meant among political scientists.
I meant that's why I'm writing the book.
Okay.
Because that typically people who study schools and the impact of school closings are completely concerned about how it impact learning loss or how it will impact achievement, essentially. And so this broader question of the fact that this school itself is supposed to be a democratic institution that enables people to be heard and listened to and to make decisions that affect their lives and to participate and engage in democracy is undermined by our limited view of the impacts of school closings to just achievement. Yeah, and so the book is really trying to intervene on that.
I have one more question, and we only have a short minute to answer it. But I just wonder what indication that neoliberalist efforts to privatize schools, in your estimation, will prevail or be rejected? I mean, that's a big question. You've got about a minute to answer. So,
in this political climate,
yeah,
neoliberalism will prevail. The struggle to close schools is going to matter more than ever. And I hope that people can understand beyond academic achievement why engaging in the struggle to keep schools open is not just about learning, but is about big questions about incorporating marginalized groups into the democratic society.
Environmental justice, equality in hiring, incarceration, all kinds of things. So, all right. I know this went quick, and we could talk for another half hour or so, but that's all the time we have on our program today. I want to thank Dr. Nuamah for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. We'll see you next time.